welcome to further conversations with Reverend Jim Conlon, the director of Sophia Center at Holy Names College in Oakland, California. I'm Barry Friedman, a psychotherapist in private practice in Oakland and an instructor in world mythology and religion at Holy Names College. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Barry. Good to be with you.
Good to see you again. Please join us now as we discuss something about Sophia Center, about Jim's new book, The Sacred Impulse, and about a new vision of spirituality and culture that is emerging at Sophia Center and at other places like Sophia around the world. So Jim, I wonder if you would first share a bit about Sophia Center and about the program that you offer there.
Call the Sophia Center a wisdom school that celebrates earth, art, and spirit. We understand wisdom at the Sophia Center as the capacity for a listening heart, to be receptive and open, not just with our ears, but open to all of life and all of experience that comes to us. When we talk about earth, we're talking about the ecological systems of life, the relationship that we have with everything, that we try to foster and nourish and generate through our program. When we talk about art, what we're really doing is celebrating the release of the imagination, that we really create not just pictures or movements, but we create a life. The creativity, which is a central part of our curriculum, is designed to unleash the imagination. And as the mystics would remind us, we're never more divine than when we create. The interior life is also what we call spirit, the origin of transformation. Meister Eckhart names the spirit as the transformer. So we promote and celebrate the transformation within and its expression outside of us. In summary, we would say that the Sophia Center is designed to foster an integral human presence in relationship to everything, that is inclusive, that is open to the divine, and designed to create a sustainable community of life for every species. Because there'll be no future for our children unless there's a future for the children of all the others. That's what we're trying to do at Sophia Center.
Thank you, Jim. You know, as you were sharing, I was thinking about the central role of creative imagination in a number of spiritual traditions. I'm thinking about Saint Teresa of Avila, for example, and the interior castle, and how she explores her spirituality in a very internally creative way. And I'm thinking also of Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, the idea that they have the concept of himma, which is the creative, dynamic energy of the heart to engage with the divine. It sounds like the Sophia Center is a place where that kind of creative engagement is cultivated.
Yes. You know, in our curriculum, we have courses on African dance, interplay, painting as spontaneous expression, your course on sacred presence, and also on dreams. We have courses on creativity in music, the fourfold wisdom, and spontaneity and sacredness. All of this is designed to unleash this deep power that's in all of us. I was just reading in this morning's paper how dealing with the energy that's in us, the creative process, is essential for health. It's essential for a life that's meaningful and peaceful, but it's also essential if we're going to advance the human project into the next generation and into the future. That's It's so important to be creative. I often say, when we're not creative, we're cranky, because we know there's something in us that isn't getting released. And when that happens, everything flows. That's what we're about there. It's like opening a spigot, if you will. The theologian would call that the dabar, the creative energy of the divine that in some way passes through us.
Thank you, Jim. Would you talk a little bit about the idea of the new story that you mentioned in the Sacred Impulse,
Right.
and also its relationship to spiritual practice?
Excellent. Thank you, Barry. You know, the new story, when we think of story, narrative theology, narrative spirituality these days, what we're really discovering is that the primary vehicle for human interaction and communication is storytelling. When we meet somebody and they become our friend, the first question we ask them is, what is your story? And the story is like, where did you come from? What's going on with your life now? How do you see the future unfolding for you? What we've discovered in our generation is that the universe itself has a story to tell us. The story of the galactic period where hydrogen and oxygen exploded into life some 13, 14 billion years ago. And then about 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth formed, this planet on which we now live. And then life began to grow and to flourish. The plants, the animals, the embryos, they all had a place. And now, as humans, the rise of consciousness and humanity is the most recent development, in a sense, the last chapter of the story that's ours to write, you know. I have had wonderful experiences the last few days as we prepare for the graduation of our class. People are gathering and expressing, our students are expressing themselves. In a sense, they're telling the story. The other day we had Jim Couture, who is a music therapist. He has written 33 songs about the new story. And he performed them, or presented them to us in our final forum. It was wonderful. And just in a couple of days, another of our students has gathered with 4 other grandmothers, 5 grandmothers telling the story of the universe through dance and music and song. This morning, I had the opportunity to read one of the master's projects of our graduating students. This woman is an artist, a singer, a performer in many ways, a wife, soon to be a mother, and she told her story. It was just thrilling to hear her understand how the Sophia program and how her spiritual journey has deepened her understanding of creativity. She's also telling the story. Just like the birds tell the story, the dove, when we hear in the morning, the breeze that blows through on our skin, the sun that rises and falls, all of this is the great story. It gives us a sense of where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. You know, you asked about spiritual practice. I've thought a lot about this question, and it seems to me that if we could say that there are 3 things that are central to spiritual practice. The first one is listening. You know, we talk about spirituality and wisdom as a listening card. So it's really important to listen and to recognize each other, but also to recognize, to listen to the story as it's told to us, as I've just mentioned, through creation. So this notion of the capacity to have a listening heart is central. It's a spiritual practice. It's a prayer, if you will. Another dimension, I call it remembering. Because without a memory, we have no story. Remembering who we are. I remember being in the presence of someone with Alzheimer's. It was tragic because I looked at this man and I realized he had no story. We need to remember our stories and invite each other to tell them. That's why our elders are so important. They have the story, and we have the capacity to remember from their memories. It's also true that letting go is the third, what I would call the third of the sort of tripod of spiritual practice. Because if we can somehow allow ourselves not to cling to life, but simply to let go. Meister Eckhart, the great medieval mystic, he wrote, he said, the soul grows by subtraction. And I think that's true. Often, the times when we need to surrender, where we feel something has been taken from us, a relationship, a job, employment, simply maybe our capacity to achieve something that we really had our mind set on. There's something about allowing that to go through us, that we surrender, not in a passive way, but by letting go, in a sense, we grow our soul. A friend of mine years ago, who was the wife of my baseball coach, I met her one day in her backyard, and I said, "Dorothy, what are you doing?" She said, "I'm just out here growing my soul." And I think if you explore what she was doing, she was probably remembering, listening, and letting go.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to get back to the idea of growing the soul,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to comment, in listening to you talk about story, I'm reminded of the importance of narrative, both in psychology and in anthropology and the history of religions.
Yes.
The way that we understand the world and ourselves is so much dependent on the narrative that we know.
Right.
And also that narrative helps to create the world that we see.
That's true.
And it's also true in a historical and anthropological sense that mythology is the fundamental backdrop against which traditional societies and cultures understand themselves and the world. And I think we've lost a great deal of that in the modern world.
That's so true. There is also narrative theology these days. I remember in my years exploring psychotherapy that often we would talk about people being in therapy as, in a sense, repairing their story. Because we all, there's this kind of a woundology in society where we sometimes present ourselves with what's lacking rather than with the vision of what could be. And some of the great writers of our time are storytellers. In fact, if we go back to the biblical stories, both the New and Old Testament were stories. The way we, in a sense, communicate both tradition, family, like grandmothers. I have a wonderful experience of people telling me about their grandmothers, especially women, because in some way the grandmother represents the family story, but also unconditional acceptance of the grandchild. And I think there's so many good stories to tell. And when we get together, we tell stories.
It makes me think that if people throughout the world could share their stories, they would see the common paradigms and motifs that inform everyone's story.
Exactly.
In Jungian psychology, the idea of the archetype, the primordial structural imprints that we receive as human beings.
That's right. Joseph Campbell talked about when we tell our stories, we open ourselves to the inexhaustible energy of the universe.
Yes.
Something flows through us. It's like there's an energy flow, there's an opening to something that's very cosmic and very powerful. And when we tell the universe story and see our lives as chapters within it, something shifts and we are able to do things that we didn't think we had the energy to do. Because a lot of this is having zest for life, fresh energy, and a kind of enthusiasm, the psychic, the spiritual strength to deal with life's burdens. And I think stories are an enormous gift to that, particularly the universe story, which is in a sense all our stories.
Jim, would you share a little bit more right now about the idea of growing the soul?
Yeah. Well, you know, my feeling is that this whole notion of soul is misunderstood in our time, or at least has been overlooked, perhaps. Because in years gone by, we used to talk about saving souls, you know, as if there was some disjunctive piece of a person that could be salvaged out of whatever was left. There is, Eckhart again is a great teacher in this regard. He says, the soul is not in the body. The body's in the soul. In other words, you know, Thomas More, the great contemporary spiritual writer, talks a lot about that, care of the soul. There's something about soul that is a counterforce to the fragmentation and the alienation that so permeates our culture, that in a sense is the result of a kind of fractured or dualistic world that you have referred to in the past. So I think what we're about is creativity, it's compassion, it's spending time with the little ones, with the poor, it's having a vision and a dream, it's remembering, it's listening, it's letting go. All of these, I think, are ways to grow our soul. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we create a sense of wholeness in our own lives, a sense of relationship with others. We grow our capacity to be a force in the world for good, to make justice possible. And really it's all about, ultimately it's about love, it's about receptivity, it's about growing our soul.
You know, I think moving away from the emphasis on perfection to the idea of wholeness is really what I'm hearing, both in a psychological and a spiritual sense. You know, perfection, I think, is actually an illusion. What we can hope for as human beings is to integrate and to become as whole as possible.
There's a woman who's an Jungian psychologist, Woodman. Her first name escapes me. She lives in Toronto. She wrote a book years ago, and here's a woman who was struggling with anorexia and bulimia. She wrote a book called Addiction to Perfection. And you know, sometimes the scripture, the Christian scripture, has been seen as a mandate for perfection. You know, we often hear the quote, "Be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." But you know, a better translation is, "Be you compassionate." In other words, the mandate of the Christian life in that tradition is compassion, not perfection. Because look at the trees. They're beautiful, but they have knots. Look at us. We have our own. Our calling is not for perfection. Our calling is for compassion, for receptivity, to be connected, and to allow ourselves to be really deeply moved by the other, and to be in relationship with some equality. You know?
I recall in reading your book that you really do hold the importance of the dialectic between the poles of reality, the light and the dark. I believe you used the phrase beauty and brokenness. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Well, you know, when you mention that, Barry, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Leonard Bernstein Mass. If you recall, the celebrant is standing in the sanctuary which has a terrazzo floor, and he holds this beautiful crystal chalice in his hand. And he throws it upon the floor, and it shatters into many, many pieces. And then he looks at it. Each of those little broken pieces carrying with it a certain sparkle, a certain energy. And he says, I never thought brokenness could be so beautiful. There is some kind of a paradox at the root of every deep truth. Spirituality is not dualistic. It's not either or, it's both and. And beauty, brokenness has its beauty, but so does beauty have its brokenness. I often think the goal of the spiritual life is both enlightenment and endarkenment. Because when we go deeply into ourselves, into our pain and into our suffering, which is part of the human condition, it's out of that we rise to a higher sense of befriending beauty, of understanding life, and of gratitude. David Standelrost, who's a wonderful person in his late 80s now, living in New York. He's a Benedictine monk. His whole world, all his writings, in fact, now he has a web page about gratefulness. If we are grateful, it means that we've let go of the thought that what we have is our own, but rather that it's a gift. That's gratefulness. I think we need to be more grateful for the beauty and the brokenness in life.
Yes. I'm reminded as you're speaking of the ancient Kabbalistic tradition of the Sephirot. These were the 10 sacred vessels of God, and they were created to receive God's effulgence, His radiance. But of course, when they did receive it, they shattered, because nothing can remain intact and hold God's radiance. That shattering is the creation of the world and of all life. So it really seems important to recognize that brokenness is a fundamental part of the creativity of our lives.
That's excellent. Teilhard de Chardin talks about shattering the mental categories under which we live our lives. Dom Helder Camara, the great Archbishop of Recife, the voice of the poor for many years, he said, allow your life to be shattered. Let the divine work his or herself through you. That's what we're about. So shattering is also the transformation of consciousness. It's moving into another worldview. It's the new cosmology. It's the new story. When we are shattered, we are actually become whole. That's the paradox.
A tremendous paradox.
Yes.
I'm reminded of St. John of the Cross and his idea of the dark night of the soul, and how fruitful, albeit painful, that experience is.
That's so true. And if we kind of research our pain and our journeys, most of us will look back at the sort of transition moments in our lives, often occasions of pain. But through those occasions, something new has happened. We've kind of gone to another dimension. So pain is not to be sought. I often think that pain is often confused with masochism. Because if we hold on to pain for its own sake, we just kind of hug it and think that we've confused it with pleasure. Because to survive as a person, you have to have pleasure. And if you're a child, very young, and you don't know the difference, anything you experience, you interpret as pleasure. And then when you get older and you have pain, you hang on to it because that's what kept you alive as a child. We need to let go of our pain, allow it to go through us, and move forward.
As you're talking, I'm also thinking, Jim, that the world is going through a dark night of the soul right now. The way we hear of so much violence and corruption, political, economic. How do you see are addressing those issues, and how does the vision that you're espousing and that Sophia Center promotes address that?
That's a wonderful question and very insightful comment. You know, we are in, some would call, a culture of death. One image I have is that of a volcano. You know, a volcano kind of erupts and everything's fluid and warm and it flows. But then eventually, as the volcano goes down the mountain, it starts to coalesce and harden. And sometimes our structures are like that. I call it, what we are undergoing today is a cultural earthquake. I say kind of somewhat whimsically, but also with truth. We need theological air hammers to release that vital energy that's been encased in these structures, and so that we have a culture of life, a mutual enhancing future for all of us.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your sharing again so much of the vision that you have been developing and offering at Sophia Center. And my hope is that this vision will permeate not only our culture, but every part of the world, so that we have a chance of healing and surviving.
Thank you, Barry. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. And I hope that if you're interested in it, you'll continue to inquire about Sophia Center and the new vision that we've been discussing. Goodbye.